Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? On this channel, I have talked an awful a lot about how much of a sucker I am for a seductively elegant mechanic in an RPG. Some mechanic is really simple, roll a couple dice or one die, not a lot of mathematical operations, really easy to understand, applies to a whole bunch of things, produces a bunch of results maybe that are fairly aesthetically pleasing. Good stuff, right? And it's been my experience that these seductively elegant mechanics work really well, except when they don't. And generally, in just about every game that has one, there's a portion of the game, a situation where it just kind of falls apart aesthetically. It doesn't really, the results aren't all that satisfying. Your mileage may vary depending on the game and upon the situation. A really good example of this is the 2d6 mechanic powered by the Apocalypse games, by Apocalypse World, or inspired by Apocalypse World. One of my favorite PBTA games, which is not hard to be one of my favorite PBTA games, is Uncharted Worlds. I've talked about this on the channel before. And so you're using that great 2d6 mechanic, a 6 or less, well, that's a failure. 7 to 9 is a weak hit, so you have a success with a complication. You don't get quite what you want. A 10 plus is a strong hit. You get, a really good success. Sometimes maybe a 13 plus is better, and you add a modifier somewhere between 1 and 3, or subtract, based upon a relevant, score, ability score, whatever it happens to be in the particular game. Works great for most situations, really pleasing aesthetically. You get to combat, and we found it was not aesthetically pleasing. We were rolling once for this combat, and you had to narrate what happened after this one roll, and it just kind of felt kind of flat and uninspired. Didn't do so great there. This video is not about that game. But let's talk about 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. That should be in the title of this video, hopefully. Once again, this has this seductively elegant mechanic, which works really well in a lot of situations, but I find it kind of falls flat for me. Now, PBTA games aren't about combat, but D&D, arguably, is about combat in all the various iterations. And so there's this mechanic, the proficiency mechanic. It's a pretty seductively elegant, pretty cool mechanic. They replaced a lot of the really complex mathematics that started to happen in things like 3rd edition, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 4th edition, with this much easier to use and administer bonus. This idea that characters have a proficiency bonus, which ranges, I think, from +2 to +6. It's dependent upon level, goes through the 20 levels, where you get this kind of rise in your proficiency bonus. You add that to anything that you have proficiency in, any kind of skill, and then you would add it to certain weapons that you have proficiency in. Cool. And then the only other thing you're going to add to the roll of a d20 is the relevant ability score, whether it's strength or dexterity or charisma or whatever, what have you. Pairs up with whatever skill you're trying to do. Melee is strength, ranged attacks are dexterity. Trying to charm somebody, well, that's going to be charisma. You get the idea. Have proficiency in it? Great, add your proficiency bonus. Fantastic. Works really well in a lot of situations. Where it falls flat for me, aesthetically, is in combat. And why? Works really well in one regard, but it's been my experience that when we're in combat, all the classes, all the characters feel just about the same. There's nothing that really differentiates the warriors, the fighters, the rangers, people are supposed to be based upon their archetype, based upon fiction, based upon what you would think of one of these people to be like, the descriptions in the book, fluff-wise. Well, nothing differentiates them from the other classes when it comes to combat, at least not in terms of their ability to hit their opponent, right? This is something that's plagued the game since the very beginning. Now, different games handle the mathematical operations differently. There's ascending armor class and descending armor class, and the older editions like original D&D and basic and 1st edition used attack matrices, and then later on they called things like attack bonus, and now here we have a proficiency bonus, right? Doesn't matter. Mathematically, it's all the same thing. Those are irrelevant arguments. Finally, what number do I need to roll on a d20 to hit the thing, to do the thing, right? And there's differentiation in those attack matrices and in the bonuses, all these kind of things, right? In the original versions of the game up until this one. But very often what happened was it took levels and levels and levels for the fighters, for the martial classes to kind of pull away from the other ones. And part of the problem with that was that people have been saying this for years, but the sweet spot in a lot of Dungeons & Dragons type RPGs is somewhere between 3rd and 10th level, arguably, somewhere around there, where the characters don't feel quite so squishy anymore, so you're feeling a little bit more secure, but they haven't become really crazy. They're not really overpowered. This is like the sweet spot where it kind of feels like what we imagined the fiction might be. And very often, those differences between the classes martially haven't really become apparent yet. in terms of things like to hit bonuses and all that sort of stuff. Just hasn't happened. They're slowly starting to pull away. And I've done, man, years ago, I did way too much research into that based upon XP and all that kind of stuff. Just hasn't happened yet. So the games, earlier versions of the games had all kinds of fixes to try to make the martial characters feel different. And there were things like first edition had percentile strength for fighters, which was, it was nuts. And damage versus large creatures, so the weapons, versus large creatures did more damage, and only fighters could use certain weapons, and blah blah blah. All these kind of things to make them feel a little bit different. And they were all kind of clunky, to be honest with you. They were good tries, and various weapon proficiencies and etc. It got kind of crazy. And the game certainly there was nothing seductively elegant about all that. And it always felt kind of samey, depending upon the game. And what I've noticed is Dungeons and Dragons, in all of its editions, is really not all that good at handling martial prowess mechanically. Kind of falls flat, especially since I played a bunch of other games which do a much better job. Now you'd think that 5th edition might do a little bit better, like look at the past and say, okay, well here's some problems, let's fix this sort of thing. And no, not really. I've noticed that, in play with the characters right here, which I'll get to in a second, the party of kids that I'm running in the library, they all feel about the same in combat in terms of their ability to hit, and a lot of other things as well. There's fixes in here that, maybe the fighters will do a little bit more damage, or the barbarian might do a little bit more damage here or there, that sort of thing. And eventually they start to get an extra attack at 5th level. Our rangers have just at 5th level. So that definitely helps. Doesn't happen again, I think, for the fighter until like 11th level. So there's just a little bit of difference in terms of the characters martially. But let's take a look at what these characters actually really look like. And I'll say honestly, and I'm going to do another video on this, as far as the fighter archetypes, you can do the champion or the battle master. Battle master, it's got a lot of interesting stuff in there. It is one of the clunkiest, weirdest, non-elegant systems I've ever seen. But the only thing worse than that is the champion, because his abilities are just plain old awful. I love fighters, and it just, why would you play one? Anyhow, let's talk about this particular party, and how do they feel, and where's the real difference? Where is their combat prowess coming from? Is it coming from their class? Is it coming from this archetype? Or is it coming from someplace else? Let's start out with, we've got Reiner, our ranger, and Reiner has a melee attack bonus of +6, a range attack bonus of +6. He's really good, dexterity and strength. He's put his money in those abilities. And he's a Colossus Slayer as well. So he gets, 1d extra 1d8 damage to like big creatures once they've been injured, So he's got that kind of ability. My friend Jose, when we were playing, with Eloy's daughter, he took, I forget what it was, the Horde Breaker, so he got an extra attack, once he attacked somebody else. The thinking man getting an extra attack early in the game. But we've got Reiner's brother Bjorn. He's 9 years old, smart as a whip. And his melee is +6. His range is +6. He's no idiot. He's 9 years old, but he uses a finesse weapon. He uses a rapier so he can get that really big bonus in melee. He also, his sneak attack bonus at 5th level now is 3d6. And he is smart enough to always be attacking something that somebody else is attacking, so he always gets that bonus. So he's arguably the biggest damage dealer in the party just about every single time, despite having a strength of 10. Then we got Bob Oakenshield, the cleric. And Bob Oakenshield, our dwarven cleric, he's got a melee bonus of +6 and a range bonus of +4. And, so he's doing pretty good with that, Now he doesn't do quite as much damage, but only by a couple points as, the ranger, and certainly not versus an opponent once it's, large opponent once it's been hurt, right? But he's hitting very often. Why does he have a +6? Well, because he decided to put, a large amount of his points, as he wants into strength. Now, this might not have been the wisest thing to do, irony intended, for a cleric, but that's what he decided to do. And this is an excellent example of where did this bonus to hit come from? Where does this combat prowess come from? It comes from raw ability. It comes from strength. It comes from dexterity. It doesn't come from your class. There's nothing that, there's nothing in the rules that, has the fighter be better than the cleric at hitting. This cleric is just as good as a ranger at hitting people because he decided to have a high strength. Moon Knight, the other ranger, she's got +5/+5. Not quite as high, but still, no slouch. Moonlight, our party druid, he has decided to have a relatively high strength as well, so he has a +5/+6 on ranged to hit. And he also, one of his signature spells, he's the youngest member of the party, as far as the player age, so he doesn't cast an awful lot of spells because he really has had a hard time remembering all of them. One of his signature spells, he's figured out Flame Blade is great, and I think it does something like 3d6 damage all the time. And so he is, right behind everybody else. He does a ton of damage every single round, and he's a druid. A Gash, our barbarian, he's a couple levels behind everybody else. He and his sister, Gamora, the wizard. And so he's our dragonborn barbarian, and so he has a +4 and +3 to hit. Pretty soon he'll be up there with everybody else. But once again, he's got he uses some of the rage abilities, I guess. He's decided to be a berserker, so he can get like an extra attack and do some extra damage, but then he gets exhausted afterwards. So he is a little bit more relevant in combat sometimes than some of the other people, but not really. I mean, maybe a little bit more relevant than the dwarven cleric, but his armor class isn't as good because he can't wear the same kind of armor that our dwarf cleric can because of his particular cleric subtype. Blah blah blah. No longer seductively elegant there, kids. And finally, last but not least, we have Gamora, our party wizard, and she is, decided to build her character much more intelligently in terms of like putting all of her ability into intelligence, and so she has a +1 melee, and she's got +4 ranged. She's no slouch, but she doesn't belong in combat because she's not proficient in armor. So she stays in the background and blasts them with, with firebolts and whatever, kind of cantrips, and uses the Eldritch, whatever that thing, Witch Bolt. Kind of cool. We'll talk about that and those sort of spells another time. But my point is, going through this sheet of all these, the actual real party I'm running of 5th and 3rd level characters, their ability in combat is generally, for the most part, dictated by their strength and by their dexterity. It is not dictated by their class. There's a couple of things that give them a little extra damage. Finally, the Rangers have an extra attack per round, which kind of helps. The Barbarian can go a little bit ballistic and get an extra attack per round. But in terms of, in my experience, watching them in a combat, watching the amount of damage that they deal to people, how relevant they are, it's about the same. Our druid, our cleric, our rogue are really just doing about as much damage to everybody else. Certainly our rogue is just, awesome at all this kind of stuff. So the game really hasn't done, that seductively elegant mechanic doesn't really differentiate the warriors from anybody else. And that is aesthetically disappointing. And it's funny, at the risk of sounding like a fanboy, I've looked at a lot of different versions of Dungeons and Dragons and the retro clones and all that kind of stuff. And still the one that comes out on top for me is Lamentations of a Flame Princess. This was a mechanic that James Radji put in, and I initially read it and goes, like, this can't work, this is terrible. In fact, I did videos on it and came with different ideas of doing different things and maybe giving everybody else, what's the mechanic? Only the fighters go up in attack bonus. They go up by 1 level, they start out 1 better than everybody else at first level, and it works phenomenally. He's got that same sort of bounded accuracy, not really the same thing, but the armor class spread is very small. So it was my experience going up to 7th level, so right about where these kids are, a little bit higher than where these kids are right now. We were none of us were slouches in combat. My wizard, with a 15 strength, was great in combat, based on who we were fighting all the time. But Durgan the Mighty, our party fighter, man, he had like something like +8 to hit, just based upon his class alone. So he's 7 places better than everybody else. And then strength, well, forget it. But that was beside the point. Much different aesthetic. And the warriors in those games just instantly feel like, or that game, they feel really relevant. They feel like the warriors of fiction compared to everybody else. With just a few levels under their belt. Really, really different than the vibe that you get from this game. So, I find it a little disappointing that they haven't fixed the problem that's plagued Dungeons and Dragons for years. And so, like, if I want to play a game where I really feel like my combat prowess is represented mechanically, there's a whole bunch of other games that do it better. Your mileage may vary.